Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to STAT's virtual event, The Future of Clinical Trials, sponsored by Paraxel. Thanks for joining us. I'm Matt Herper, senior writer for medicine here at STAT, and in just a few moments, I'll be joined by our featured speaker to talk about the future of clinical trials. But first, a few quick housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a few icons. There is a chat icon and a Q&A icon. Use the chat feature to talk amongst yourselves, as I see many people are doing, or to send a message directly to the STAT team. You'll see us as STAT events. But don't put your questions in the chat. The questions, and I hope you have them, please send a lot of them, you should use the Q&A feature to type them, and we will try to answer them live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you'd most like to see answered. This is a big help to me. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end. You can go ahead and start filling that up now. This is part of what makes these events special. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to first welcome Rosamond Round, Vice President of the Patient Innovation Center at Paraxel, for a brief introduction. Take it away, Roz.
Thanks very much, Matt. Hi, everybody. As Matt said, my name's Rosamond Round, and I am Vice President of the Patient Innovation Center and Decentralized Clinical Trials at Paraxel, and I'm delighted to be here today to make the introductory remarks. It's an exciting topic, particularly when we think about how the world is changing and what that means for us. You know, it's a strange world where the first things you now do when you think about leaving the house are grab a surgical mask and grab some hand sanitizer. It's a strange world where we see that schools are closed for months and months on end, that video is now the main way that we connect with friends and family rather than with hugs, and that the US president takes an experimental treatment to help in his fight against COVID. So this and the race to develop the vaccine have really led to a huge focus on clinical trials in a way that we've never seen before. And the industry is really having to transform to meet the needs of patients in clinical trials, and thinking about the fact that hospitals have been closed mostly to all of those apart from those with the real urgent need. So home-based or decentralized clinical trials have been the way that the industry has really responded to this, to be able to meet patients' needs and maintain patient safety and continuity on trial medication during the pandemic. We've also seen that it's decreased the burden for patients to participate, and we really like to look at every single step of the journey along the way to see how we can make patients' lives easier. So for anyone not familiar with home-based or decentralized trials, one of the features is around telemedicine, something that you're probably familiar with to some degree. To be able to have your discussions with your physician via video rather than in person has really been a necessity for most. I live in a really small village in England, and a year ago, I don't think anyone here would have thought that this would be the normal way that we would interact with our physician, but actually everyone's adapted really well, and it's just become our new normal. Similarly, on many trials, sensors has become something that's quite popular and quite common, where things like blood pressure and activity levels can be monitored remotely and checked for patients too. Study medications also being delivered now, much like Amazon parcels are being sent to our doors every day. Medication can be delivered in that way so that patients don't need to go to the pharmacy. And also nurses can come to people's homes to be able to undertake study tests and procedures. So with these changing times, we've made sure that we've spoken to patients a lot, and we've heard from them over the past months that anxiety can be a real issue for people, particularly if you have a pre-existing condition and need to go to the hospital. It can be something that is really a worry. Also, it's been a lot of news that everyone's seen about the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on people from certain ethnic and racial groups. And by being able to provide research in the home, it can really improve access and also experiences for both of these patient groups that I mentioned previously. So we're living in a new reality now. Things are moving quickly and we're adapting fast to patients' needs, being able to combine clinical development expertise with patient input and also technology to be able to deliver research effectively. So this widespread technology adoption that I mentioned with telehealth and us all Zoom calling our friends and family has really helped with adoption of decentralized or home-based trials in general. So physicians, for example, I think a lot of physicians were probably quite reticent to use some of these things before, to try telemedicine. But as we've been speaking to them, they tell us that actually compliance has tended to improve. It's a lot easier for a patient to simply click a button than it is for them to have to travel and take time off work to go to a site. They've also found they've still been able to make really human, positive connections and have really really useful discussions with patients. And one of them actually described it to me as being a bit like the olden days of a house call, where you get this insight into a person's life that you wouldn't when they come to a clinic. Patients too are getting used to having an easier time of things on trials, to having things that are more convenient to them. And with that and the real focus on research, we've seen a great deal of interest in this area. And finally, the regulators. So the FDA were already enthusiastic and supportive of decentralized clinical trials. But with the pandemic, what we've seen is regulators around the world actually pivoting and enabling a lot of these things to happen as well, which is something that we hope and believe will continue for the future. So Rob is here today to talk about the future of clinical trials, but it kind of almost feels like we're living in it. So what we predicted in terms of these home-based approaches to occur over the next 5 years swiftly happened in the case of just a couple of months. Technology's been evolving quickly as well. We're seeing things that are more sophisticated, more intuitive, more simple to use, and also just in terms of drug development in general, vaccines and treatments that used to take years and years to develop are now really being made available much faster. We're seeing that there are multiple candidates for COVID treatments already, and we're hopeful that over the coming months that some of those will come to fruition, and hopefully many lives will be saved and we can all get to back to some degree of normality in our lives. I also wonder what else we're going to learn. Being able to accelerate drug development in such a way is something that no one knew was going to happen, and what an opportunity to learn and see how we can develop other medications faster to help patients around the world in the future. I'm sure there are more industry developments that are really exciting and that we're going to see coming soon, and I'm sure Rob will be talking about them too. But to me, it seems like the events of 2020 have really led to a huge leap forward into the future of clinical research, and it's just something we couldn't have anticipated, and I'm really excited to see where it leads us. Thank you very much for listening. Now back over to Matt. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosamond. Now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker, who doesn't need the introduction, but I'm going to give it to him anyway. Robert Califf is currently the head of clinical policy and strategy for Verily and Google Health, along with an adjunct professor at Duke University and Stanford University. You might also know him as the former commissioner for the Food and Drug Administration nominated by President Barack Obama, and also as one of the biggest names in cardiology clinical trials and clinical trials that there's been. So thanks for joining me today, Rob. And a quick reminder to all of you out there to be submitting questions in the Q&A. A lot of you already have, which is amazingly gratifying to see. Thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, virtually. So before we get to the topic at hand, I wanted to ask you about a little bit about the news. You made a very big statement when you were the FDA commissioner about the need to avoid any political interference in the regulatory process. And recently, you and I think every other former FDA commissioner made a statement that you were concerned about regulatory political interference in the regulatory process right now. Where do you think we are right now with the FDA and with its independence at obviously a crucial time?
Well, first of all, let me just say, the statement that we made was every former living FDA commissioner. We thought about going further than that, but realized it was impractical to do that.
You know, if you'd had some drug company funding, you might have been able to manage it.
No comment. What I would emphasize is, the core of the FDA is unperturbed by this. I mean, it's, I knew this before because of my FDA interactions, but when I spent the first year at FDA as a civil servant, it took a while to get through the nomination and confirmation process. And you know, the FDA employees, 17,000 of them are used to seeing political appointees come and go. And so there's a really solid scientific public health basis for the FDA that continues on. So I don't see that being changed or affected much. The second point I make is that political interference is a really bad thing, but it's also naive to think there's not political influence. I mean, public health and social political issues can't be completely separated. And a big job of the commissioner is to be the buffer between the politicians who have every right by law actually to oversee the FDA and push it, to be that buffer, particularly for individual medical product decisions, so that the process can work without undue influence. And then the third point is we are in a precarious position right now because it is a fact that there is indeed a chain of command by law. The FDA is part of the executive branch of the government. The FDA, the center directors who make the individual product decisions are overseen by the commissioner, who reports to the secretary of HHS, who reports to the president. And in terms of the statute, the secretary has the authority. It's always been delegated to the FDA commissioner, who has 99.99% of the time delegated the authority on individual product decisions to the relevant center director. But legally, the authority resides with the secretary, who reports to the president. So we are in a precarious position right now.
And why is it important that the decision be made by the FDA staff and not by that chain of command? The president could just make it himself. Why should it be made by the FDA scientists?
Well, there are two reasons. One is, maybe three reasons. One is the FDA scientists know the most about the specifics of any given product. And here I want to separate policy from individual product decisions. I think a useful way to think about the FDA, if you're a sports fan, is that the FDA is like a group of referees, and the referees act according to the rules of the game. They admire people who play the game well. They love it when there's a good game, but they basically make decisions based on the rules. But the referees don't make the rules. The rules are made by the people that own the league or oversee the sport. And that's the way the law works. So the commissioner has a very vital role in policies, but not on individual product decisions. And then in addition to that, it's critical. The FDA in the courts is recognized as not just a regulatory body, but also a science-based organization. Imagine a world where a judge could say, well, politicians are making these decisions, so why shouldn't a judge be able to make the decisions? We would be spending our entire national budget probably on lawyers trying to defend the FDA from aggrieved companies who are using the courts to try to get back at decisions. And, I learned a lot about this. The Sarepta decision that I was involved in, the whole issue was, should a political appointee, myself, step in to overrule a center director who traditionally is the ultimate line of authority? And my decision was not to step in because it sets a dangerous precedent for politicians intervening in these decisions.
All right. Let's get on to clinical trials. I'm actually going to go right to the questions because there are a lot of them and they are in line with a lot of what we wanted to talk about. And I'm going to start with a nice big general one, which is from Ratnakar Pocha. What are the changes to clinical trial management that are here to stay long after the COVID-19 dust settles? So it's changing the way we're doing things, right? What's going to stick?
Well, It's far beyond me to say for sure. I mean, the one that I
What
would.
do you want to stick? That might be a better question for you. I know you're not a guy to ask to make predictions.
Yeah, the one I'm an empirical guy, but I mean, the one I would, we're going to find a different set point for the mix of virtual, digital, and in-person activities. And I think, what's already happened in clinical practice, and appropriately so, at the peak of COVID, and particularly the uncertainty of not knowing what to do, the whole clinical world switched to telehealth. But what happened then is, now that we have begun to work out systems to take care of the issues, people actually want in-person visits. They don't want to be 100% telehealth. And so it's swinging back. And the question is, where is the appropriate set point? And I think, the set point will be different in clinical trials, depending on the type of clinical trial, how sick the patients are, how experimental the treatment is. But I think we will find a different set point. I mean, some of the things I hope for, we realize that you don't need to take 2 months to negotiate a CDA or to get a contract signed to do a basic piece of research. We don't have to fight for a year over a budget. These things actually can be done if there is a willingness to do it on all sides. We can also get consent digitally, which is a really important part of this. And we can move a lot of the assessments, as Rosamond already said, to things that are done at home, and they'll be done just as well. I really think, and this has already started with the FDA, but I think all of us need to be engaged in an interrogation out of the things that we've done, what worked and what didn't. Let's have the arguments and then move forward with the things that work. We can talk, I think in the questions it'll probably come up, but there's some things that haven't happened that may be more important than the things that have happened.
Well, that's not a bad place to go next. So why don't we just go ahead and do that? What are the things that haven't happened that you'd like to see happen?
Well, one of the biggest is that that we're not doing the right clinical trials. So Janet Woodcock, in a meeting last week, I wasn't there, but I was told, she said they had done an analysis in warp speed, and 6% of the clinical trials being done in the US would produce something that was a meaningful result. And, I've been working with Janet a long time, and clinicaltrials.gov was something I was very involved with and still follow closely. And this is no different than it's been. I mean, if you look at all the clinical trials, now that we can look at them, the vast majority are either too small or not asking a question that most people would be that interested in. And yet when we look at clinical practice, 95%, 90% at least of our major decisions in practice are not supported by high quality evidence. So, that we didn't fix. Amazing volunteerism by people and clinicians to get engaged, but we didn't have a system for organizing to get the trials done that really mattered. So,
right. I mean, the most obvious example would be all the trials we've done that have been ongoing with hydroxychloroquine, right?
Yeah,
single agent. Yeah. We just saw the recovery data in NEJM, and it looks not just not beneficial, but potentially harmful.
Yeah. So, and there are just many examples of tiny little trials being done, unclear exactly what the reason is. When if we identified the most important questions and everybody worked together to get them answered, we could actually provide patients and clinicians and health systems with the information they need to improve health. There was just a trial from Brazil. I was particularly pleased because a big part of it was a group that we helped start in Brazil as sort of an offshoot of the Clinical Research Institute that I used to run. And azithromycin, how many people were treated with azithromycin on a theory that it would work? And, you could have, if you had given double placebo, you would have gotten exactly the same result, just absolutely no difference. Mm-hmm. If we could have answered that question in the first month if instead of arbitrary treatment decisions being made based on theories. We actually enroll people in clinical trials and got the answer.
So, question from James Lynch, which I think dovetails with this nicely, which what are your thoughts on large, simple trials in which limited safety data is collected? We've
Well,
seen some success in the large, simple trial idea with recovery, right? I mean, that's been our biggest information delivering trial during this pandemic.
well, I mean, a lot of people probably tuning in know how painful this is for me, and but let's start with.
You can go all the way back to there if you want.
Yeah. Let's start though in the recent pandemic in the U.S. There was all this disaggregated stuff, and a bunch of studies were started, most of which are not going to be very useful. And in the UK, a group got together and said, let's decide the most important questions, set up a platform, minimize extra data collection, make it part of the jobs of the clinicians and the National Health Service to participate, encourage them to do it. And they're reeling off answer after answer that's guiding our practice while we're still having committee meetings in the US about how to organize the trials. And so that has raised a lot of discussion in the popular press and the science world. But now let's go back to 1988, and we had just figured out what caused heart attacks. That's still hard for young people to realize. We didn't know prior to then, but some cardiologists did some angiograms, and lo and behold, it was a blood clot that was the culprit. So
I think people still don't understand that a lot of the time, that it's the clot, not just like the pipe clogging from
right
building up, but it's this explosion that happens in there.
You got it. And so then the question was, what do you do about the blood clot? And there were at least 100 different approaches to be used. And for some reason, all around the world, it became the thing to do to enter your patients in randomized trials. So we reeled off a whole series of trials that were very simple, 3 pages, 1 to 3 pages of data collected, answered the questions. The FDA was completely behind it and supportive of doing it. But for some reason, it sort of fizzled out, and the whole enterprise became this very complicated thing. And most of it completely unnecessarily complicated that actually detracts from getting the answer, because so much of the money is spent on useless stuff that's never looked at. And I think, a good example, I think the questioner was bringing up, after you entered about 1,500 people into a clinical trial on a drug, you pretty much have the knowledge of regular adverse events, hiccups, coughing, indigestion, all those things. You're going to get a rate, and you're not going to add a whole lot in the next 30,000 people. Now, you will discover rare, serious adverse events in those next 30,000. And so the idea is focus on the things that matter, minimize your data collection so people can actually participate in the numbers that you need to get definitive, reliable answers. And don't collect all the stuff that it's not going to add any new information. But the world, and we actually did a whole series of trials like that all through the 1990s and 2000s in cardiovascular disease, but it just didn't catch on. And it's been very hard to beat it down, but maybe now we will, because there's a thing that I now call the LST plus. So, the issue in the large simple trial at the time was, the big technology innovation that made it possible was the fax machine, because we didn't have the internet. I know that's another one that's hard for people to believe, but other than the military, the internet didn't exist. And so when the fax machine really became in place, you could check some boxes and stick it in the fax machine, and it would be delivered to a central location where people could enter it. But you could only collect a certain amount of information. And so a lot of work went into deciding what to collect and how to do it well. But now it's a different world. Everyone has an electronic health record, and that's really the future and it's what the recovery trial did. So you can say, let's focus on limited data collection for what really matters, so we get that right. And then all that other stuff that people may be interested in, let's make the EHR and claims data better and better so that we collect it and harvest it really electronically, and can radically reduce the cost of that additional information.
So I know that, talk a little more about that. We've gotten some questions about how you would use real world evidence in these trials, this is one way of using real world evidence, right? The synthetic controls and making, post hoc analyses it's get a lot of attention, but really merging the EHR with the clinical trial process. How do we do that? Because it's not happening for the most part yet still.
Agreed. I mean, the attention is in the wrong place. So, and I was on a call with an unnamed FDA official recently lamenting what's happened is that a lot of people are interpreting the real world evidence mantra as implying that you can get by with a sloppy observational comparison and try to run it through the regulatory system. And doing observational treatment comparisons well is really, really hard. And there's a great growing literature on how to do it well. And I would say less than 1% of the papers that are published, and 100% of the ones on COVID treatments, to my knowledge, just don't meet the standard. Because in essence,
we had a big disaster with that, with the Surgisphere data.
Yeah, right? That was one of several disasters, but that was a big one. And so, but even if you have good data, being able to simulate what a randomized trial would do in terms of getting time zero right is really the hardest problem. Because I won't go in, maybe if there are more questions, we'll go into detail there. But the point you made is really the important one, which is that the greatest, and we went through this when we did 21st Century Cures, there was a glitch that occurred that we had to correct. And this may still throw some people off. So just to go through it quickly, the idea was that real world data is data that's not collected in a special research setting. It's like everything except what's collected in a special research setting. But the data is meaningless unless you apply a method that creates real world evidence. So one of the methods, the most important, is actually randomization. And so when they write a law, right at the end, they close the doors away from the technical experts and finalize the law. In the case of 21st Century Cures, it was 48 hours before. And they came out, the law was finished, it had been agreed to. It was wonderful. I loved the law the way it came out. But they screwed up the real world evidence clause in the law and defined it as everything except randomized trials. And there was nothing we could do about it, but we figured out that when the user fees were passed into law, we could then go back and amend the law. And if you read it now, it has the right term, which is that real world evidence is everything except traditional randomized clinical trials. And that means that randomization is a really important part of real world evidence. Now you asked the question, why don't we just do it? I mean, we all know that EHRs were a total mess and they're gradually getting better and better. And one of the things we're working on at Google, as are a number of other people, is the automation of curation of electronic health records to produce the kind of data that you really want. And someone like me would argue, one of the dumbest things I've seen in any industry is the idea that you would have an electronic health record as your primary data source. Then you have a study coordinator who's printing out the electronic health record data so they can transcribe the information into an eCRF somewhere else. It's like, why on earth would you do that? So I just think it's a matter of time. And I think the slope of acceleration of being able to do this is going to be pretty dramatic.
So we actually have a question from Tasha Lester, which is, can you tell us more about the lessons you've learned about this since joining Verily Google? So any other cool stuff you want to mention?
Well, I mean, I would just say that, this is obvious, but it's different when you actually feel it. The computational capability is no longer the limiting factor. It's all about the human interactions and the rules by which we interact with each other. So in other words, we could move very quickly to automate the system, but there are a lot of impediments which are, understandable, but we need to figure out what to do about them. The hoarding of information, the concerns about privacy, which are legitimate. The fact that people think that healthcare data is valuable, so even when it would help people to share it in a confidential way, people don't do it. And I want to be clear, I'm not arguing that all this data should go to Google. That's not my point by any means. It's just that the impediments right now are not computational, whereas if you went back 10 years ago, they really were computational. There was just not a way to do it. No matter how much code you wrote, it couldn't be done. Now it's pretty simple to do. We got to figure out the human interactive systems. I also think the other thing is that because the computational capability now enables streaming of data, we're going to see over the next few years a transition to streaming of real-time data. And artificial intelligence and machine learning are going to be just humming in the background. They're going to be a commodity. 2 years ago, if you could talk about artificial intelligence, you were exceptional and special. Every health system now has people who can do machine learning. And so that's going to be a very different environment. The ability to trigger when someone's at risk or when they should be entered into a clinical trial is going to be relatively simple. And how to deal with that is going to be a really interesting challenge that we'll need to figure out.
So this is the big question we're getting from people. In fact, the top two upvoted questions are the same question, which is from Deb Piazinski, which is what steps are you taking to ensure racial and socioeconomic diversity in clinical trials? And then Vera Roland, what are your thoughts on how to increase diversity and inclusion, especially for underserved participation in clinical trials? And there are actually that question's phrased several more times. And when we think about this, you've got all sorts of issues in here that there's access to the technologies you're using to decentralize, but there's also, we know that there's not diversity enrolling in clinical trials easily now. We saw it very clearly with the early vaccine trials where they started out mostly in white men. Does technology provide us a way out of this?
Well, I mean, technology is like any tool. It's a double-edged sword. It could be used for to go either way. And in my standard lecture now, I have a fork in the road. We can either use higher forms of technology to further divide us and further improve the already longer life expectancy and sense of well-being of wealthy, highly educated people like most of us on this call, or we can use it to raise the level for all people. And they're clear decisions that we need to make. And I would just point out that the current, I think this is all, let me say a couple of things. It's all mirrored in the US healthcare system, which is a purposeful disparity producing engine because of the way people get paid. And so if we look at the United States, we see up to 15-year differences in life expectancy as a function of what neighborhood you live in or what county you're in. And it's definitely still race and ethnicity impacted, but also now just pure education and wealth impacted, with rural white men between Oklahoma and West Virginia showing the fastest deterioration in life expectancy of any group in the United States. And so what are we going to do about that? Well, I think when it comes to clinical trials, we know what we need to do. We're going to need to help the healthcare system itself change, because fundamental to this is people having access to digital technology and having a system where they're human helpers who help them deal with it. In other words, almost everyone has a cell phone now, but if you look at the digital divide, it's not access to the internet, it's the capability of dealing with it in an effective way, and in a way that speaks to you where you are related to your health. But much like our healthcare systems, where we have all, for example, all the endocrinologists clustered in cities, turns out that, you know, high-end specialists like to hang out together. And you got these vast expanses of rural areas where people would have to drive 3 hours just to get to a clinic in the US. Well, clinical trials really mirror that. But believing that you can do it just by providing digital technology is not going to work, because you do need a human interface to help integrate the digital technology with the human part of it, which is essential to clinical trials. So what Rosamond mentioned about trial personnel being distributed out in the neighborhoods and in the communities, I think is clearly a way to go, much like we need community health workers for our common chronic diseases in the healthcare system. So, and I do want to add, the NIH took this seriously while I was FDA commissioner. And if you look at NIH clinical trials, they have done it. And the way they do it is, if you get an NIH grant or contract to do a clinical trial and you're not reaching the diversity criteria, you have to stop enrolling the people who are in excess, so that you are forced to focus on enrolling the people to make it a diverse trial.
So we're seeing that with the vaccine trials now.
Yeah.
Do trial participants need education in these cases? Asks Lauren B. Cronin. And how do you deliver and track that virtually, right? How do you?
Yeah. Let me just finish one other thought. The diversity thing is a problem for the FDA, because the FDA is dealing with a global industry. So when you say Hispanic, for example, that means something in the US. It doesn't mean anything if you live in Europe. And so we're only 4% of the world's population. And so the FDA has limitations on what it can mandate to global companies doing clinical trials. And you know, that's an issue that we're going to need to deal with. So education. You know, this is probably the most obvious thing to me. If you look at YouTube and search, two products that I you know, have a minor role in helping with. Karen DeSalvo is the chief health officer at Google Health, and you know, does a lot of work with us. Most of the world's population uses one of those two for a significant part of its information. And what we really need to do is to create content that is there continuously, and not depend on each health system in each particular instance to figure out what the content should be, or each clinical trial, because that will never work. It's too labor intensive. And to do this well, you need to have the information in a format that people can relate to it. You know, a rural North Carolinian needs a very different approach than an urban person in Los Angeles in terms of the context in which the information is relayed. I learned a lot about this at the FDA with the tobacco campaign. The user fees allowed us to hire the PR agencies that the tobacco companies used, and it was amazing to me to see how detailed the channel could be by which people communicate if you want to reach them. Mm-hmm. So I think the key here is we need a continuous platform for health education, which is very different than what we have now, and I hope that we'll all work on it together.
This is a really fascinating question. I feel like we need a fun one now. How do you think efficacy endpoints might evolve over the next decade? Asked Christine Blazinski. And I think I want to ask about monitoring. You know, I've always thought since people started wearing Fitbits, I've thought, you know, that sounds a lot better in theory than a walk test, right? How long can you walk in 6 months or whatever time period you're going to get to see how long, whether it's a heart failure patient or a Duchenne patient, to be able to see how much someone's actually moving due to an intervention. But integrating that kind of stuff into trials has proven pretty slow. So, and I know it's something you're thinking about at Google. So,
well, let's let's take a step back here on that one. And, first of all, let me be a little counterculture and say, I think the tremendous drive to use biomarkers as the efficacy endpoints, it's going to have a limited life, because I think they're absolutely critical in the development of drugs and devices and other therapies like behavioral therapies, to get a sense of where to go. But they're also critical if you have a lethal disease for which there is no other treatment, or maybe just one other partially effective treatment. But at some point, once you get a couple of effective therapies, you got to figure out which ones actually affect the real health outcomes the best. And I think society is going to demand it, because the payment system and the health systems just can't absorb all this technology without knowing out of this technology which is best. So I think we are going to be moving after a phase, because we have so many like rare genetic diseases, for example, where there is no effective treatment now, and certain types of cancer. I'm all for the accelerated approvals and all that exist now, but we're going to move into the old FDA mantra, which is feel, function, and survive. Those are the three things that really matter to people. I mean, if I asked you, why would you take a drug? I think most people would say if it causes you to live longer, function better, or feel better, that would be a reason. Taking a drug because your LDL cholesterol is 5 points lower, if you don't feel any different and you're not going to live longer, you probably wouldn't want to do it. So here's where the digital technology becomes absolutely critical. And the point is that, and I completely agree with you, if you want to know if someone's more functional with heart failure, it's obvious that if you could monitor their activity 24/7, you would have a much better measure than a 6-minute walk test. Problem is, the technology is, you say it's slow. I would say the technology is just getting there, and we have major problems with how to deal with artifact and missingness. And I want to harken back again historically to a point in medicine, and when the operating rooms became, when physiologic monitoring came into the operating rooms. It was wonderful, because you went from blood pressure cuff now to continuous ECG and pressure monitoring. But what happened initially was there was so much artifact that a lot of mistakes were made in the OR from reacting to the artifact and giving, potent treatments that were not indicated. And I think we're just going through that phase now. It's going to take longer, because we're talking about, an enormous body of knowledge and sensors that are being developed. But ultimately, I do think the efficacy endpoints will be, how functional are people? How do they feel? And, there's a technique that I just love called Momentary Ecological Assessment. It's a fancy term for, we're going to ask you at random intervals, just pop up on your cell phone, how are you feeling, or something like that. And in a population, you can get a really good sense of, how people are doing over time, in real time, where they can really answer the question, how am I feeling now, rather than 6 weeks later, when I come to a research clinic, how did I feel 6 weeks ago? Right. And then survival is going to be important, but knowing who's dead and alive is just getting easier and easier, because everyone has an EHR, and that's a key element of the recovery trial. So
we're no longer in the point where companies are going to have to hire Pinkerton to go figure out who died in a trial.
There'll still be some of that, but not much.
So something else that we spoke about before this that no one's asked, but that I think we should talk about is, you talk about, are we doing the right trials in terms of answers? But there's a real therapeutic focus in which trials we do. And there's a great question here that someone would love to hear more about digital therapeutics, but also diagnostics and other types of interventions don't get nearly the kind of rigorous study that we insist every drug has, right? So I'd love to hear you thinking about that a bit, that, where should the clinical trials be happening?
Yeah, you're making me wish I was a professor again, because there's a lot of this I'd like to write about. But so yeah, if you ask the question, why do we do the clinical trials we do now the way we do them? It all goes back to Kefauver Harris before 1962. For the youngsters in the audience, um, you had to have some semblance of evidence that a drug was not unsafe, not obviously unsafe. But the primary evidence of efficacy was that doctors prescribed it. And when the thalidomide disaster occurred, that was a safety problem, but really smart people got together and said, let's put in a law that says you have to be safe and effective. And so the efficacy criteria then developed. A guy named Bob Temple, who's still at the FDA, was the primary actor here. And the concept of the adequate and well-controlled clinical trial came up as a criteria for being able to market a drug. Now, at the time, the then Institute of Medicine, now National Academy, was tasked with looking at the drugs that were on the market, and 3,000 drugs were taken off the market that had no evidence for efficacy. My favorite one was a drug that was marketed to teenagers with opiates in it to deal with their mothers who were going through menopause. That was literally on the label. And so, and there were doctors that prescribed it. So we've come a long way. But really, the whole clinical trial industry developed because you couldn't get a drug on the market then without doing a clinical trial that met the FDA specifications. And so that put all the emphasis on drugs and getting over that hurdle. It was only later that the device legislation came into play, largely driven by the Dalcon Shield. And the device stuff was watered down because, as you know, there are hundreds of thousands of devices approved every year, like bed rails and hospital gowns and all kind of stuff, which is not a high-risk device. But then, for high-risk devices, it's getting closer to the criteria for drugs. But all that does is relate to a standard of, is it safe and effective compared to nothing?
Mm-hmm.
What does the average patient or clinician want to know? They want to know, out of the options I have, which one is best? And we almost never answer that question because there's no financial incentive for the companies to do it. And one of my favorite papers that I had a hard time getting accepted, and no one ever talks about, was just looking at the question: if you actually think that your drug is better than the competitors, and you do a net present value calculation, will you get a positive net present value for doing a head-to-head trial? Mm-hmm. And the answer is almost always no, mm-hmm. because there's a significant risk that you will, by chance, not detect that your drug is better, even if it is, and you could be wrong. And by the way, marketing a drug does pretty well without ever having to prove that it's better than the competitor.
Well, so we've seen that when you're wrong, I mean, we can go back to Bristol and Pfizer and the statins, right? Like, when you find out you're wrong, it's bad. The other guy can use that against you much better than if they did it themselves.
Yeah. So we need a system that answers these questions that are the primary questions that people are concerned about. Of course, we want new drugs and devices, and we want cures if we can get them. But for the most part, therapies are modestly effective. And if we just look at a field like multiple myeloma, there are now dozens of treatments on the market. Nobody knows which is best, and there's a lot of guessing going on in practice. And we need a system that incentivizes answering these questions.
Do you know what that system looks like?
Yeah, I mean, it would be payment for value. Mm-hmm. Because then if that happened, the health systems would say, I don't want to use your drug unless you actually prove that it's better than the other options I have, which may be lower cost. And they would be incentivized to enroll their participants in the clinical trials and encourage them to do it. I'd also add that would be a solution to the diagnostics problem, which you alluded to, which is a major problem. I mean, the evidence we have for most diagnostics is pathetic. And the pandemic, showed that problem full force again. And it's not because device manufacturers are shady when they make diagnostics. It's just, it would cost a lot of money to do the right studies using the current methods that we have. And we need to have incentives where if your diagnostic actually has value, the health systems would want to put money into it and want to know how to use it.
And so that leads to two other questions we have here, which are, again, I'm seeing the same question pop up, which is what can be done to reduce the cost and duration of clinical trials? That's from Alexander Kuznetsov. Or David McCoon, who asked really bluntly, what's a reasonable per patient cost here for a remote clinical trial? How much cheaper can we make this and maintain quality? I think recovery is pretty instructive here again, right?
Yeah, I mean, here, Matt, I'd really strongly urge that we be careful about our terminology. So I mean, remote clinical trials per se may save a modest amount of money. But if you're doing a complicated trial and you do it remotely, you're not going to save that much compared to, using a research site in a traditional way. You still have a lot of personnel time because, home visits involve personnel time and travel and all that stuff. So I think the key is not whether it's remote or not. That is an important factor. And the more we do virtually and digitally, the better, as long as it's safe and more efficient. The key is simplification of all these data collection and ancillary things that we do in clinical trials that are unnecessary. And that's where recovery was so important, and it harkens back to those trials in the 1980s, 1990s. I mean, recovery was a hospital trial. It was pretty far from remote. 25% mortality in the first 30 days in that trial. So it's really the fact that they had a couple of pages of primary data collection, and then they harvested the EHRs for more information, and the follow-up was done using the NHS aggregate system. So I think it's less remote or not. I think it's more a simplification, and the price per patient should be the right price. And and so really, to me, the most important division is early phase clinical trials require all the detail that's currently used, in my opinion. When you don't know what a drug is going to do, you'd better have a lot of data collection and a closely supervised intensive system. When you get into late phase 3 and beyond, most of what we do is a waste of time and money. And if we focused on what we needed to do, I think we could reduce the cost by more than an order of magnitude, which is what recovery did. It was a fraction. And I'd also urge people to look at the inclisiran trial done in the UK using similar methods, in a chronic trial, 1/10 the cost of a traditionally run clinical trial. At some risk, I'll also add in, right now, the ballooning of costs is largely related to the interpretation of regulations that lead to a proliferation of human labor. So if you look at a trial budget, half of it is going to the CRO. And I'd love to see many more trials done. So CROs would not go out of business, they'd be very busy. But most of the money would go to the investigators and the support of the patients who are enrolled in the trial. There'd be a much thinner layer of administration, much like most other industries have done. And the total cost per trial would drop down. And then you could answer these more important questions that come up. Let me also mention, watch the monoclonal antibodies for COVID, because I don't know about Regeneron, but I think they'll do the same thing. Lilly is going to be very committed to do post-market. Let's assume there's an EUA, which is, it's up to the FDA. I think there's so many questions about what's the right dose, when you should administer it, who the high-risk people are. Lilly's very committed to do, randomized real-world evidence trials, not against placebo, but comparing different regimens to get this sorted out. And I think that's going to be the model of the future.
Comparing 3 and 6 grams or something. And,
yeah. You know, I still remember, Matt, early in my career, there was a monoclonal antibody called ReoPro that we did the trials on. And at the key FDA hearing, we had done a 3-arm trial with 2 doses, and it wasn't clear which dose was best. We dropped 1 arm. And the committee was all hung up on what's the right dose. And they were arguing and arguing. And finally, Bob Temple, the guy I mentioned before, stopped everybody and said, okay, tell me the right dose of any cardiovascular drug and we'll not let this go forward. And there was like 5 minutes of total silence. Because for the most part, you know, we make some guesses in development and then we go with that dose. And we never come back and refine the dose for most of what we do. That's something that we can fix.
So, well, and we're at about that was a good. Well, so we're at about closing thoughts time. So I'm wondering if there's anything you want to get across that we haven't gotten to say yet. What do you wish I'd asked up till now?
I don't think there's any magic question that would unleash it. I guess my great hope is that people that are on this call will, in their individual organizations, go back and look at the pandemic response that your organization has made in the clinical trials arena. Within the organization and across organizations, ask the hard question of what worked and what didn't. What would you like to keep? What would you like to do away with? And let's create momentum to really move to the next level of clinical trials. And again, I want to urge caution about remote being the key thing. I really think it's more focus. And there's a term that a friend used that I also think is really important. It's and I'm blanking out on the term, but it's the trial should have meaning to the patients and the clinicians. And it's still been the case that if it's a really meaningful question that people want to know the answer to, the trials generally get done reasonably well. But so many of the trials we do, if you said, would I want to participate in this? Would I recommend a relative participate? Is it really taking into account the needs of the participants as opposed to trying to answer an abstract question that's a theory in someone's mind about a drug or a device? All too often, we just get that wrong. So purposeful clinical trials that are meaningful to the people to whom they matter are really important. And then finally, I hope that the transparency on the meta story of clinical trials, that is clinicaltrials.gov, I'm quite proud that in my time as commissioner, we pushed through the final rule that says you not only have to register your trial and register the results, but you have to submit the protocol and the SAP and the consent form. I'm hoping that the transparency will help us get rid of the trials that are not useful and focus everyone's attention on the trials that really matter. And the information is going to be there to, you know, and I hope people and institutions that do clinical trials that aren't useful get embarrassed so they stop doing them. Because we can answer these questions if we got the system in gear.
All right. Well, thanks so much. We're at time, and I want to thank our sponsor, Paraxel, and thanks to Rob for joining me today. And thanks to all of you out there for attending. Keep an eye out for more STAT virtual events. We do our weekly conversations every week. And in virtually next month, we'll be having our annual STAT Summit from November 16th to November 19th. I hope you'll join us, but until then, stay safe and be well.
Thanks, Matt. I don't give out compliments easily, but keep your thoughtful articles going. And I think a lot of people are reading those now and get a lot out of it. So keep probing.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Bye.